He left a zero where a tip should have been. Not a careless omission, not a confused pen stroke. A jagged circle, hard as a coin. The ink pressed through the thin receipt until the paper tasted like defeat. Sarah Miller stared at it with the kind of calm people mistake for blankness. Her hands, still damp from clearing the table, curled around the receipt as if they could fold the indignity away. Around her, the restaurant hummed, the clatter of plates, the low swivel of a mop, but her world contracted to that tiny square of paper and the dull ache under her ribs that always rose when she thought of rent, of Leo's next prescription, of the call from the clinic a week ago that had sounded more like an ultimatum than helpfulness. We'll try to help where we can. Try. Help where they can. The customer had been tall and neat and smelled faintly of lemon. He had sat at table 7 with an entourage of suits and an air that made the other patrons drift a little farther away, leaving a semicircle of quiet around him. Sarah had served him the same way she'd served everyone, with the practiced cordiality of a person who had learned to make herself small and present at once. He'd watched her do it, the small movements, the way she removed a curl of lemon rind from a plate and set it aside like a small confession. And when the bill came, he had looked at her with interest, as if reading a line in a book he meant to keep. "Is there anything else I can get you?" she'd asked, and he'd allowed a smile that did not reach his eyes. He left no tip, not even the courtesy amount Henderson insisted on when customers were sensitive types. Henderson, who thought the world was a place to be managed, whose tie seemed to be wired into the restaurant's mood, had shrugged as if the man had simply made an aesthetic choice. Jessica had shot Sarah a look over the pass, a mixture of triumph and small cruelty. The rest of the dining room had not seen what Sarah saw, the paper with the black zero crossed through, the manner in which the man pressed his napkin down with his thumb and left without a backward glance. It wasn't the money, it was the message. When she lifted the charger to clear the plate, the note fell out, a thick, folded scrap the color of old envelopes. It had been tucked under the china like a secret. She unfolded it, breath shallow, fingers that still smelled faintly of lemon. "Prove it. Pier 59. Midnight. Come alone." 7 words, each one a small instrument. The handwriting was careful, almost indifferent, as if whoever had written it had practiced making commands into polite sentences. No name, no flourish. A single silent dare parked itself at the center of Sarah's chest. Someone had watched. Someone had not been satisfied with the way she had answered his question, or he had wanted to know whether she could be moved by the sort of quiet indignity he dealt out like currency. She could have crumpled the paper, thrown it away with the rest of the trash. She could have taken the zero and accepted the humiliation as another part of a long ledger of small losses. She should have. She had bills that balanced like toys on the edge of a table, a 5-year-old who sometimes wheezed in sleep, and a pharmacy bottle that had been on hold as if waiting for Faith to answer it. Yet the note moved inside her like a key falling into a lock she'd forgotten she had. Henderson found her with the mop and a pail when she tried to fold the receipt back into the place it had come from. He was short in the back and long on practical bluster. "Everything okay?" he asked. And when she didn't answer, he leaned close. "Is that the new one? He's a regular. Sterling crowd. They tape heavy. Sometimes they like to keep you guessing." Sarah swallowed. The name had come out of a mouth like a coin. Sterling. She had heard it before. The man whose face had been on charity flyers with grainy photographs, the one whispered about in the neighborhoods as someone who could offer a job or a threat with the same hand. There were rumors that his legitimate businesses moved more than freight, that they moved people and favors dressed up like paperwork. You kept your head down with those names. You kept your eyes on the dish rack. She folded the note slowly and slid it into the back of her apron like contraband. The lemon rind, removed earlier, sat in the crumbs of the plate like a small, bright regret. She took the night shift the way she took everything, with a slow accumulation of choices. Bus fare or skip a meal. Work overtime or call in another favor. Pride would sometimes sit on her tongue like sour candy, sweet and impossible to swallow. She thought of Leo in his cramped room, the IKEA dinosaur nightlight blinking, his soft breath the only rhythm she allowed herself to match. His cough had started again that afternoon, just a small rattle, but it had set loose all the stored fears in her chest. His breathing, the doctor had said, could be managed with medication, but managed cost money. There were options that required signatures she didn't have, and other things that required a risk she didn't know how to weigh. She kept her head down for the rest of the shift. She pocketed the note and told herself not to go. She cleaned up spilled coffee, took 2 orders that crossed at once, and made sure the cutlery was perfect.
She made herself small in the face of people who carried their money like armor. Then the kitchen phone rang. Chef LaRosa's voice crackled over a single, sharp syllable. Table 7 called again. They asked for dessert, she explained. They were leaving. Take whatever they've left, he said, voice flat like hot metal. If they're rich, they waste. She moved past Henderson, through steam and the clatter of pans, and found the booth empty. The men were gone, the table warm as a hand.
She slid the folded note into her pocket and told herself she would not go, that it was lunacy to respond to an anonymous summons. She told herself the words that made other women feel safe, that someone who treated a server like that had no business in her life. She told herself she would protect herself and her son by staying invisible. On her walk home, the city smelled of rain and exhaust. Streetlights made puddles look like small, bright promises she couldn't reach. The bus rattled and hesitated, and Sarah felt the weight of the note against her thigh like a pulse. She thought of the clinic walls, of waiting rooms with outdated magazines, and a nurse with kind, tired eyes. She thought of every time she had chosen food over a bill, of every apology she'd made to landlords. If she didn't do something, debt would calcify, and Leo's cough would be the meter that ticked them both into silence. At home, Leo was asleep with a slate of crayon dinosaurs abandoned across his chest. Sarah kissed his hair and felt the quick, stabbing joy that children offer like a blade. She took the folded note from her pocket and smoothed it on the table. The words made less sense by lamplight, but their edges were still sharp. Prove it. Pier 59, midnight, come alone. He's not a monster, she whispered to herself. He doesn't have to be. At 2 a.m, she stood in the darkness with a jacket wrapped tight and the folded scrap of paper in a pocket. She left a sticky note for Leo on the refrigerator. Mom's gonna be home late, and mouthed apologies to the hush of an apartment. The elevator took her down and spat her into fog that crawled off the river like steam. She bought a coffee she didn't want and watched her breath in the light like something she could measure and hold. Pier 59 was a place where memory and industry met and made a bargain. The city brought bodies, and the river took their rest. At midnight, the pier smelled of salt and cold iron. A black SUV waited under a high lamp as if it had grown out of the asphalt. Men moved like predicates around it, short, silent, the kind you saw in films who seemed carved from restraint. One of them wore an earpiece, and the light in his eyes slid sideways like a blade. There was a girl who looked like a receptionist, except she wore a coat 2 sizes too small, and the shadow of the car fell over her like a hand. "You're late," a voice said without moving. It was neither cruel nor kind. It was an accurate observation, the way high men describe weather. "Sarah Miller," she said, because strangers insisted names, and because names could be proof against erasure. The man in the driver's seat turned and looked at her with a face that had been smoothed by wealth until his features were pragmatic. He had the look of someone who read people for a living and who liked what he read in the way she moved. He wore leather gloves and a coat that kept him just outside the weather. "Your son," he said.
The words were not a question. He folded his hands like a church wanted them, the kind of posture you arrange to appear unthreatening. "You need money. You have bills. I tried leaving a tip and watching how you reacted. I wanted to see if you noticed." The muscles along Sarah's jaw did something she didn't feel. "You left a 0, she said. He smiled without lighting his face. A 0 is a question. An answer is more valuable. He patted the seat beside him, and when she hesitated, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small stack of manifests, bound with a rubber band. They smelled like paper left in damp places, the smell of work. He laid them on his lap as if presenting an offering. 1 hour, he said. Find the leak. Show me what's missing. She had been a waitress for 7 years. She had watched the world from the periphery and learned a measure of patterns, where cutlery was misplaced, which patrons liked to overstate themselves, the way a chef's hand trembled when something in a pan went wrong. Pattern recognition for her had been survival. It had been identifying that a certain customer always asked for extra napkins because he left money folded into them, the way a certain colleague always worked late when the cash box shortage made the math odd. She could read certainties in small motions the way other people read faces. But this was a different kind of table. Paper held the weight of accusation and the potential of salvation. The warehouse at Pier 59 was a place of noise and echo. Crates towered like sleeping beasts. A single bulb swung and painted long fingers across the concrete. The man who drove the SUV, Ethan Sterling, moved through the space like he owned its silence. He was a man in whom many stories had been invested. Businessman, philanthropist, the rumor-made figure who kept docks and banks humming. The papers he'd given Sarah were manifests, lists of loads, weight stamps, destination codes, signatures. They were tidy, a worker's alphabet, and yet something about them offended her eye.
There were marks that repeated, the looping scrawl of initials, a tiny dot at the end of a number, a courier stamp that had been smudged in the same manner each time. "Read," he said. "Don't guess." She spread the papers on a makeshift table and overturned crate, and let her hands move like they had during nights with an apron on. There were weights, dates, and the names of companies as innocuous as fruit. Alder Logistics, Coburn Imports, Sterling Maritime. And then, on several sheets, the weights recorded for otherwise identical shipments were off by a consistent 10%, the kind of difference that could be explained away to accountants as variation, but not to someone attuned to the feeling of the numbers. Each adjusted manifest bore the mark MT in small identical script, a mark that never appeared on legitimate accounting, but was there enough to form a repeating pattern. Marcus Thorne.
She had heard the name, Marcus, like a chord played too often. "Marcus Thorne," she said. Her voice was slow, as if testing the syllables. Ethan's jaw tightened. "He was my supervisor there once," he said. "He had been with me 10 years. "She's been signing these," she said. "And where he signs? For third-party contractors, small companies, anonymous pickups. They match dates where mass shipments reported missing tonnage." The bulb overhead diplit his face. He watched her with a stillness that could have been patience or calculation. "You see a pattern," he said. "Most people see figures and they count what's there. You count the small absences." She did not feel proud. She felt useful in a way that frightened her, like someone who had put a hand into a dangerous place and found it warm. "You've been around numbers," he said, "around people who mark things out." "A long time," she admitted. Truth was safer than the alternative explanations. "You have a supervisor who's been taking weight. He's signing it off." "Who profits?" Ethan asked. "Someone who moves them on," she said. "Someone with trucks and a kiosk. Someone who makes it not look like one man taking, but like the work of logistics. And someone who can make receipts mean whatever they want." She said Marcus Thorne's name like a fact, and in saying it, the warehouse felt smaller. Her attention had always belonged to human scale, the thread caught on a tablecloth, the way a patron tapped the rim of a glass when lying. These sheets were the same, brittle threads of evidence. He watched her as if she were an experiment proving itself. "Prove it," he said, and his voice was the same as the notes, an echo that landed heavier in her chest than she expected. She had an hour. The manifest trail began to germinate into a story. She found a courier stamp that led to a small logistics partner in a neighboring district. The contact numbers didn't ring through to a call center. They ran to a voicemail box with 3 separate names. Paper footprints. She noticed an address that repeated, a small warehouse across the river where private pickups were made at odd hours. She triangulated dates. The math leaned the way she needed it to. When she held up a receipt whose handwriting matched the marks of MT, Ethan's face lost the calm it had worn until then. "Marcus's family," he said. "Not by blood, but in the way men become anchors. One favors the other because he's been there since the docks were dirt. He can't have been stupid about this." "What would he be doing with it?" Sarah asked. "Where would the weight go?" "To a front," Ethan said. "A front that looks small, collects what no one watches, and moves it where it can be laundered into accounts no one asks about." She said nothing for a long moment, because saying nothing was a way of measuring the risk. People like Ethan made deals with language. He used soft words like front and launder, giving compression to things the city only ever hinted at in the paper. The men who stood near him had the kind of faces your mother told you to ignore. Their silence tasted like readiness. "You could go to the police," she said finally. "If you have proof, it's a thing you can do." "You think I'm some man who wakes up and goes straight to the police?" Ethan's hand brushed a manifest as if he didn't quite own the touch. "No, this is not about virtue, it's about control. Evidence is a tool. It decides who holds power. Do you want to help me use it?" "Help him." The words made her hands tremble. He slid a photograph across the crate, a 5-year-old with a laugh that took the edges off a photograph. Leo's coloring in her mind rearranged the city's geography. It made anything possible if it could be paid for. No more appointments that racked up bills, no more nights where she counted the hours until payday like praying. Ethan watched her in a way that made honesty easier to admit than denial. "I can solve the surgery," he said. "I can write a check and make it look like a favor. But I need someone who will look where others don't. Someone to be there with small attention, the way you tend to plates. You could be my eyes. You could tell me when people get sloppy." There was 1,000 ways to refuse. There was also nothing in the world like the thought of Leo's cough fluttering like a bird caught in his throat. And then, after a procedure someone executed with the cleanliness of a machine, settling into the square of wood and light in their apartment again. "Why me?" she asked. "Why not an accountant? Why not someone with a suit?"
He smiled, and this time his smile held something like recognition. "Because you noticed the lemon rind," he said. "Because you took it away in a small way that made the whole meal better. Because you didn't assume that zero meant nothing. You saw the way a man uses absence as language." Her mind flashed back. The simple act of removing lemon rind from a plate. It had been so small a thing she would never have thought it mattered. He had been watching, in the way men of his world watched things and people for use. She did not like that he had been watching. She did not like that he could reduce her to an inch of skin and a stack of paper and still offer what she needed, like a physician with a wrapped syringe. "This is a test," he said. "Work with me. For a time, we see what you can do." He tapped the stack of manifests. "And if you find something, there will be money. There will be help. And what do you want in return?" The question came out sharper than she had intended. "Eyes," he said. "Honest eyes. Someone who can be in rooms where others don't see, who can make small observations into decisions."
Someone who isn't part of their world, and so can tell its patterns. She thought of Leo again, of the way a child's small body could carry the hard facts of adulthood like a pack. She thought of being seen, and of the fear that sometimes, when powerful people were being kind, they were asking for loyalty in return for mercy. What about... She paused. She thought of all the boundaries she would cross just to keep breathing. What about truth? I won't be used to lie. You won't be asked to lie, Ethan said. You will be asked to notice, to relay, to watch. The rest is choice. It was an offer wrapped in velvet and barbed with implication. She could resist. She could walk back down the pier and forget the note, and the city's small cruelties would probably continue to eat them alive. Or she could step into a room she had never been allowed into and do work she knew she could do. Observe, name, call out. She held his gaze and felt something in her answer steady itself like an anchor line in wind. "If I'm going to do it," she said, "I do it to pay for my son's care. I won't be your entertainment. I won't be your scapegoat." "Agreed," he replied. He took out a thin envelope and pushed it to her. "Introduction money, immediate, enough for what you need now." The envelope was thicker than she expected. When she slipped it open, her stomach filled with a light she couldn't have named earlier. There was a check inside, large, crisp, the kind of paper a bank would accept without looking twice, and a small card that had nothing to do with the restaurant where she'd been scrubbed raw by adolescents. On it, a name, Ethan Sterling. Underneath, a number and an address. There was a line that read in smaller type, "Use well." She found she was shaking, not with cold. She looked at Ethan, at the men standing like statues around him, and she saw the smallest part of a man who had been taught to buy silence and salute loyalty. "One condition," he added, "you don't tell anyone where the money came from. Discretion is part of the work." "That's not hard," she answered. She folded the check back into the envelope and slid it into the pocket of her jacket like a secret she would keep. He stood, all at once the measure architect of this chapter of the pier. The earpiece in the man's ear blinked like a watch. "You have until morning to decide whether you'll come." He paused, and the quiet of his voice changed to something that almost suggested promise. "If you accept, come to the office. Wear whatever you want. The city is more readable than most people think." As she stepped away, the note in her pocket felt heavier in a different way. She didn't know the edges of what she had taken or where they would cut her, but she had bound a promise with one hand and a desperation with the other. She had accepted a question and stepped into the sentence. That night, when she returned to the apartment, Leo rolled over and clung to her like a magnet. She kissed his forehead and let herself be small in his presence, because that was the place she could be brave and tender without title. She made coffee with hands that knew the tremor of triumph. The envelope hadn't changed the sound of the city. It had only adjusted the way the world might answer. She slept in snatches. In the early morning, she woke and counted the hours until she could go to the clinic. The check would bridge the gap. It would buy medicine, a surgeon's appointment, the time between panic and the steady, routine kindness of a system when it decided to be just. For now, the promise of possibility kept her awake like a child who has not yet fallen into the heavy sleep of the morning.
When she handed the check to the clinic administrator, the woman behind the desk erased the stern lines from her face and treated the paperwork like it was a small triumph. "We'll do everything," she said, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah believed it. In the days after, Sarah found herself at Ethan Sterling's office, a glass monolith that put the river at its feet and pretended it had a claim on the horizon. He had sent a car, a black thing like the one on the pier, with a discreet driver and the whisper of security. Inside, the world smelled like polished wood and a quiet that tried to buy consent. He did not speak of gratitude. Instead, he gave short directives and a set of rules: how to present herself, where to stand in rooms full of people who measure value with a currency she didn't understand, and the most crucial point, observe. He said it in a tone that wasn't unkind, only precise. "Watch and tell me what you see," he said. "Notice what people discard. A thrown napkin can lead to a pattern." Sarah hated being watched, but she had offered herself for a reason. She began with small things: the way a certain board member twisted his ring when lying, the perfume a woman wore when she wanted attention, the specific way Veronica Vance, Ethan's fiancée, and the kind of woman the city offered up for admiration and caution, tilted her head when a lie was being told. Veronica was all blades hidden in silk. She smiled with teeth that belonged to teeth, and used charm like a currency that devalued everyone around it. Ethan met Sarah in neutral rooms at first: a clinic waiting room that smelled of lemon disinfectant, a small office with a view of cranes. He watched how she cataloged people like a server catalogs orders, a no-nonsense system that didn't take pride, only accuracy. He would give her manifests and then watch as she found the detail that mattered. "Do you resent me?" he asked once when they sat over coffee that was neither particularly bitter nor kind. She looked at him as if at a photograph. "Do you know how it feels to be invisible?" she asked. "No, this job doesn't fix that. It gives me tools. It will put you where people see you and still don't see you. Power doesn't change looking, it changes consequence."
She learned the rules quickly, because need teaches you more brutally than school ever could. There were nights when she returned to a room and felt the old shame arrive like a guest. But there was also a new feeling: agency, like a tool that could be used for a task whose geometry she was only beginning to understand. She collected patterns the way she had always collected them: an odding of writing, a consistent courier route, a signature's tilt. And yet, with every small victory, the city reminded her that where light shines, shadows lengthen. There were whispers. People unfurled the rumor of her in corners, not with jealousy, but with distance, the way people step aside from a fire they fear. Henderson's eyebrows creased like a measuring instrument when he heard she had been seen in the Sterling lobby. Jessica's smile grew thin in the kitchen. "You look like garbage on a coat rack," Jessica said one night when Sarah refilled the salt because someone had asked. She said it with that even, petty malice that people like to practice on the less powerful. Sarah answered nothing. Not because she could not think of a reply, but because the work Ethan had given her required a sort of economy. Words sometimes cost too much. There were small successes. A mismatched courier stamp proved a pickup at an address she watched, and a delivery manifest, rerouted, lined up with an invoice marked to a shell company. A pattern unfurled. The more she saw, the more she realized that power liked to dress its theft in the language of business, and the language was comfortable with the greedy. Her first-hand knowledge, how a plate was cleared or how a man rearranged his napkin, translated surprisingly well into finding a forged line on a ledger. When she told Ethan, he folded his hands and let silence be the kind of answer that sharpened. "This," he said, "is what I needed." In that phrase there was a gratitude that tasted like the ocean, salt and magnitude. There was also an implication, quiet and inevitable. The work she did made his world safer, and safety was a thing that his world rewarded in ways that people like Sarah rarely saw. For some reason, the money that fixed the clinic bill felt like the first coin on a counter that might become a stockpile. But prestige didn't make humiliation vanish. There was the night of a small gala, one of those charity meetings spun from larger PR webs, where Sarah found herself in a dress that felt like a costume, elbowing among people who smelled expensive and who kept conversation at the pitch of a distant tide. Veronica Vance glided through the room and smiled at Sarah in that way predators smile at prey that shows effort. A man at the bar, Mr. Coburn, a heavy investor and a man whose vocalization of disdain made headlines, made a comment about service staff at a distance. "And yet, even now, it is useful to have a face you can applaud,"
he said loudly, and his friends laughed as if he had told a joke they owned.
Sarah felt her mouth shape a reply that would fit in the bite-sized etiquette the room demanded, but Ethan's hand pressed hers under the table. He did not make a spectacle, he simply squeezed, and the pressure was communication. Not yet. Later, when she stood at the edge of the night and felt both seen and invisible, he said, "Hold your head. They will look at you. They will not understand you. That is their failure." It would be a lie to say she was untouched by the taste of those rooms. They were beautiful in the way a shark is beautiful, glossed and dangerous. There were moments when she felt she had climbed a ladder made of someone else's knuckles. There were times she nearly accepted the idea that her presence would be paid back in an affection that would make everything easier. But Ethan never asked her to be anything more than she had been, attentive, mobile, deliberate. That did not make the world less complicated. On an unremarkable Sunday, the world put pressure on its seam. The board meeting came like a storm, a routine called into attention because money is an animal that begets arguments. A motion had been tabled, an internal procedure about shifting assets. Veronica sat at the right hand of Ethan in the boardroom, a portrait of composure. Marcus Thorne's name appeared in a brief exchange that Ethan fielded with the kind of compartmentalized ire that signaled both betrayal and calculation. The small things Sarah had noticed, the way Marcus's signature looped, the courier stamps lined in a series, became a matter of inventory. Ethan required proof. He required enough to make a motion either crumble or hold. Sarah tracked a courier van that had made an unscheduled late-night pickup. She had watched a slip of a manifest tucked into a wallet during a card transaction. She had collected what small agents would accept as breadcrumb evidence, paper, witnesses who spoke in measured ways, receipts stamped with times. But nothing about Power's world was direct. There were smiles that pretended to be useful and then stepped aside for knives. Veronica's smile, which Sarah had considered a defensive thing, began to look engineered. She wore bankruptcy of warmth like a necklace. People around her took their cues from the way she breathed. Men in tailored suits tended to her like priests on a shrine, projecting onto her the kind of admiration that did not translate into loyalty for anyone who challenged her. "Careful," Ethan warned when she told him she would go after Marcus. "They will not like someone from your world and theirs." "That's okay," Sarah said. "I don't belong to either entirely." What followed in the days after Marcus's exposure was a change in rhythm. Things that had been invisible came into view like creatures at the edge of a pond showing themselves to feed. Meetings were called, notes appeared, people who had once been silent became suddenly vocal.
Sarah watched other people move, and in watching she saw how many hands reached into the same pot. Obamas of influence glided into action. Then a thing happened that she had not predicted. A night where she thought she was near the top of a turning wheel, the wheel spun and flung her towards its rim. A forged transfer appeared in the system. It bore a timestamp and a login that put her credentials at the center of its path. The transfer could have been made by anyone with access, but whoever had created the frame had been careful. They'd used small things she recognized, an old login format, a template she had once used in training, that made the scam cruelly plausible. The evidence was damning on its face. When the accusation landed, it did so with theater. Veronica's voice, rehearsed and sleek, carried through the corridors. She did not need to shout. She existed in a register that made pushing an accusation feel like arranging a photograph. "We have found irregularities," she said in the boardroom, and the room seemed to lean in as if breath had weight. "And the trail leads to Ms. Sarah Miller." The room was a thing of glass and authority. She felt small there in a way that a cost-cutting memo never could have taught her. Papers slid across mahogany with the polite violence of a sentence being delivered. The faces around the table were bland proofs. The investor who had once complimented her now folded his hands as if punishment were his entertainment. "You need to leave," Henderson had said once, in the restaurant, meaning it as practical management. At that moment in the boardroom, it sounded like an edict she had not been offered a moment before. The words landed like a gavel. Papers were pushed forward, brows knitted. Phones were turned so their faces lighted like accusatory stars. Sarah felt the world thin to the narrow groove between two panes of glass. Her name tasted foreign in her mouth, as if someone had dressed a small boy in expectation and called him sir. She tried to explain, to show the receipts she'd gathered, to describe the courier stamps and the pattern she'd seen in Marcus's mark. Veronica's smile braided its teeth around every sentence she attempted. The room had the kind of silence that was bred by wealth, practiced and ready to be deployed. "You were given credentials," Veronica said, and her voice was lemon-sweet and surgical. "We have logs. We have a transfer that left the network during a window you had access. It went to accounts associated with a third party on a Wednesday night. Your login timestamp matches the exact minute." Sarah's throat caught on the metaphor of exposure.
She had used no login to make transfers. She had never even been in the finance portal except when Ethan had walked her through what to notice. Yet the documents looked like evidence.
They were precise where accusation needed precision. Timestamps, a username, a small trail that looked neat enough to be true. She was given no benefit of curiosity. The board listened to Veronica like a jury already decided. The investor, Mr. Coburn, folded his hands as if folding her into a neat package. Faces in the room pulsed between curiosity and schadenfreude. Part of the cruelty of power is that it enjoys the spectacle of humiliation. Ethan's face remained closed. For a moment it was a mask of inscrutable distance. Then the expression warmed slightly, as if the part of him that watched people for their usefulness was calculating whether her usefulness could survive this. He said little. His silence, in a room full of the sound of accusation, felt like a sanction. "You're relieved of all duties, effective immediately," said one of the legal men, an unreadable instrument in gray. The words were a stone dropped into the river of her life. They escorted her out as if she might spill contagion, soft hands against her elbows, footsteps that kept pace with an ending. People who had praised her observational skills as novelty now offered the sort of polite nonchalance that announces social death. Veronica's eyes met hers with the steady flame of a person who had rehearsed victory. Outside, rain had found the city and was knitting it into a blur. The streetlights made halos around puddles and made the night look like it knew how to forgive. They left Sarah under the overhang of the building, with a thin piece of paper, but the paper was heavy with its implications. Her ID badge, once a currency to be flashed for access, now felt like evidence she had once been somewhere she shouldn't have been. At the curb, a car waited. Ethan's driver hovered like a courtesy that had died. Sarah's hands were numb in the rain, not with cold but with the kind of outrage that burned slow and precise. She had expected danger when she took the job, but she had not predicted this. An engineered fall that used all the things she'd learned about small gestures against her. She slept that night in a motel room whose window showed the city as a series of anonymous lights. Outside, the highway moved like a ribbon of indifferent motion. Inside, her breath made a faint trace on the cracked mirror. Leo's drawing, crayon suns and a crooked dinosaur, was tucked into the inner pocket of her jacket. She read the child's scrawl until her eyes blurred and tried to keep her chest steady. The call from the clinic scheduler had been friendly and then practical. They needed a deposit to confirm a slot for the surgery. The check that had bridged the immediate crisis was gone. Someone had papered over it in a way she could not understand. She felt unmoored, dismissed not because she had done wrong, but because a better lie had been told with greater polish.
Henderson's voice from months earlier echoed, a small tyrant in an apron, and she had the odd sensation of being a dish left in the sun until it cracked. Fury rose, sharp and functional. This wasn't just humiliation. Someone had tried to remove her from the equation, to erase her usefulness before she could make a lasting mark. She reached for help where she had once been content to be alone. JR answered on the second ring, his sleek gravel voice softening the moment he recognized her. He met her with the sort of solidarity men who worked the docks had for each other, direct, private, reliable. "I always thought you'd get them riled," he said, without pretense, "but not like this." "She made it look neat," Sarah said. "They used my access." "People get framed," JR said. "People who are useful to others get framed more often than not. We find physical things, that's what we do." They went back to Pier 59 before dawn, when the fog rolled low and made the world a drawing made in pencil. The warehouse smelled like salt and cardboard and heated machine parts. JR moved among the crates like a man who recognized every dent and scuff as an old friend. He took her to the underside of their old storage manifest shelf, an archive of slips, ledgers, and physical courier's receipts, less likely to be touched by the executive's sanitizing hands. "No one thought to burn paper," he said. "People who want to look clean hire people to clean their history, but some things are too small for them to notice." They fished through a crate of discarded receipts, finding the faint impressions where someone had run a slip through a cheap printer. The receipts were margin-thin but natted. They matched the courier stamp Sarah had cataloged months before. One, in particular, had a time that contradicted the transfer timestamp used to incriminate her. It showed a physical pickup at a location across town 15 minutes later. Another had a card imprint that matched a boat rental company whose ledger showed a withdrawal. Each piece of paper was a pebble that, when thrown together, might cause a ripple. "Look at this," JR said, holding up a small receipt. The ink had smudged, but not enough to hide a signature. The handwriting was slanted the same way Marcus's documents had been, a small flourish on the T, a dot placed like an afterthought.
Yet the name signed the Neeg was not Marcus's, it was a proxy's. The proxy's name matched a vendor who shuttled shipments late at night. You see, Sarah said, the sentence a cold metal thing. They took my login pattern and used it to craft the outline, but the physical pickup shows the goods moving at a time that would have made me physically unable to be at both places. We'll need more, JR said. Timestamps, witnesses, and a courier who will speak. People lie, but paper is harder to fake when it leaves a trail. They began a stitchwork of inquiries.
JR called in favors, dock workers who owed him small debts, a courier who remembered a late-night pickup because he had spilled his coffee and cursed for an hour. Sarah visited the small warehouse across the river where she'd first seen the curious courier stamps and sat in her plain coat, listening to men talk slowly. She used the skills she had honed in the restaurant, eyes that memorized gestures, the way a man flicked his cigarette when he lied, the way a name dropped into a sentence and changed its weight. A courier named Mateo remembered a delivery. A crate moved in the dead hours to a small service dock near an upscale marina. Mateo's voice was thick with the cadence of a man who did not involve himself in drama. They paid cash, he said. They were jittery, told me to be quick, left me $100 and to keep my mouth shut. I didn't take the money then, but I recorded the pickup note. Haven't used that log in months. Sarah's notebook filled with notes that were not the kind of digital ghosts Veronica's frame had used. They were analog, time-stamped receipts, coffee-stained slips, a signature with a smudge that matched Marcus's known habit. Each piece of evidence was a small muscle flexing back. They found a courier receipt with a serial number that dug a tunnel to a GPS log. It wasn't a hack, it was a mundane operator's report, an internal ledger from a freight aggregator that still tracked shipments with a clumsy kind of honesty. When Sarah called and spoke with a woman who handled logistics at odd hours, the woman remembered a client who had withdrawn shipments on nights Marcus was logged as supervising. Her tone held the kind of fatigue that comes from seeing human greed pattern itself into work. We filed an exception, the woman said. It flagged as an outlier, but the person in charge shut it down. He said it would be resolved. Who shut it down? Sarah asked. She gave a name and a number. A chessboard became a map. The name belonged to a minor executive, someone who made appearances on legitimacy while his hands were put elsewhere. Sarah felt the circle closing. Veronica's fingerprints were everywhere. The boardroom grace note, the polished accusations. The frame had been assembled like a costume. The more they uncovered, the clearer the motive. Veronica's campaign to consolidate power. If Ethan were to be removed, if the board voted him out, she would be the one placed as steward. She had engineered narrative devices with the precision of someone who'd studied optics, make a woman from a humble background the face of wrongdoing, and ensure the board's moral panic would prefer stability to scandal. If Sarah could be made into a villain, Veronica's climb would look like preservation. There were risks in chasing the truth. Veronica had allies on the board and in the media. She had a way of moving accusations like coins, buying silence with good dinners and better smiles.
Yet truth had a stubbornness about it when it was papered down and united by human testimony. Sarah and JR found a courier, Mateo, willing to meet in the belly of a diner at dawn. His hands trembled as he put a thermos in front of him. "They threatened me," he said. "I was afraid, but they paid me only once like that. After that, I quit that crew, but I kept the receipt. I didn't think much of it until I heard you had been blamed." He slid over a receipt that had been folded into quarters. The fold matched the one Sarah had seen before. The ink was faded in the same place where someone had pressed too hard. Mateo's signature on the bottom was his mark, an S-shaped scribble that could be matched to the physical receipt Sarah had unearthed at the docks. "This will help," Sarah said. She felt the word like a small engine starting. It all required timing. Veronica had moved quickly, planting the frame during a board meeting scheduled to vote on a reallocation of assets. The board's calendar was a machine that could move a company into safety or into scandal in the space of an hour. Sarah had the physical evidence, Mateo's receipt, the courier's operator ledger, a small boat rental receipt that tied a particular pickup to a marina where a known shell company kept a berth. She had witnesses who would speak without flourish, dock workers and a logistics clerk whose conscience had been pricked. She had one more thing, the check stub that had originally paid for Leo's emergency deposit, a paper trail that had been manipulated. They moved like a band of guerrilla archivists. JR used his access to pull security footage of a date that had been reported as late night by Veronica's camp. The footage was grainy, but it captured shapes and the small musicality of movement. 2 men carrying a crate, a van pulling into the loading bay, a timestamp in the corner that refused to be smudged. It was not an obvious smoking gun, but combined with Mateo's receipt and the route logs, it built a narrative that matched the physical world, not the fabricated one. "She's good at this," JR said, looking at the compilation of paper and grainy footage. "We'll have to be better." They needed a strategic breach, the board meeting where Veronica would attempt to secure her ascendancy. Sarah knew she could not simply burst in and yell. That would be theater, something Veronica excelled at. She needed the sort of evidence that moved bacteria, small, contagious facts that when combined would cause a biological reaction in the room. The board was a body that reacted to reputation. She needed to give it a fever.
The day of the meeting, the rain stopped and left the city with a shine as if it were admitting to having been washed. Sarah walked into the building with a folder heavy with receipts and a smaller, battered notebook of hand-scrabbled notes. She had no legal standing, but she had allies, JR, Mateo, and the logistics clerk who had agreed to be present as a witness.
They had arranged with one of Ethan's older friends on the board, an ally who still believed in method and who remembered seeing Sarah's work as something other than a curiosity, to bring the papers in with the firm's counsel. Sarah had rehearsed what she would say like one rehearses lines that may save a life. Her voice did not tremble. She used her observation like a scalpel, precise and spare. As the board convened, Veronica took the floor and did what she did best, spun a portrait of danger, a woman framed by carelessness, a man who needed steady hands. "We need to cut loose what threatens us," she said, every word dipped in varnish, "for the company's future." The motion to remove Ethan had been prepared on a legal pad, like a guillotine sharpened and polished. The room hummed as if at the approach of a storm. Sarah waited for the right moment. A board member, one who lived by process and not by spectacle, noticed the council's papers and the weight of the folder in Sarah's hand. "We have new evidence," he said, perhaps not expecting the sort of bomb she was about to drop. He had arranged with JR and Ethan's ally to allow her to speak. She placed the documents on the mahogany table like an offering. The sound of the paper hitting wood was small and fierce. Veronica's smile hardened into a line. "Who is she?" Veronica asked, voice designed to wound. "Someone you're trying to erase," Ethan replied, and his voice filled the room with a gravity that did not show his inner turmoil. He had the look of a predator startled by mirrors. Sarah spoke simply. "This timeline doesn't match the transfer you used," she said. "These receipts show physical pickups and routes that contradict the digital footprint you've used to pin this on me. Mateo was paid in cash to pick up crates. The GPS logs of the aggregator show movements inconsistent with my login. There is a pattern of signatures tied to a courier chain that funnels goods through shelf fronts. Veronica used my credentials and timing to build a frame." She laid out Mateo's receipt, the boat rental slip, the aggregator log, the lobster red smudge on a courier manifest. Each piece she placed was not a pronouncement but a footprint. The room watched like a congregation that had been told to expect a miracle. Veronica's allies murmured. The council's face shifted. Ethan watched her with an intensity that reminded Sarah of nights on the pier, a man who preferred control to noise. She felt him there as not only judge but observer of the work she'd done. He scanned the evidence with the sort of woman-like focus she'd been praised and dismissed for in the restaurant world. "You brought us paper," he said finally. His voice was less a judgment than an invitation to look. The legal counsel turned the papers, reading with the calibrated patience of the profession. A man at the end of the table, one of Veronica's supporters, began to sweat in a way that made him look suddenly mortal. The evidence did what paper always does when allowed to be true. It resisted being held down by a neat lie. The courier's name, when traced, matched in the count where small withdrawals had been made. The boat rental serial matched a log entry the aggregator had overlooked. The timestamp disparities were something an algorithm didn't invent, but a human hand could. Veronica's veneer cracked. "This is preposterous," she said. "You are manufacturing coincidence." Coincidence, the room knew, had a tendency to become conviction when multiplied by enough paper. A committee was called. The council, compelled by the new evidence and nervous of legal exposure, called for an independent audit. Veronica pressed back with the practiced calm of a woman whose social life had sharpened her competitive edge. But the cog she could not turn was the human testimony. Mateo stood in the doorway, his jacket damp, his hands clenched around the receipt like a rosary. He recounted the night of the pickup with a voice that did not attempt to make itself attractive. The logistics clerk corroborated the aggregator's discrepancy. JR, tall and plain, spoke of the fatigue and inconsistencies he'd seen on the docks. Each human account chiseled away at the construction Veronica had set up. Then something else happened. One of Veronica's own allies presented a piece of information she had not expected. A junior accountant, startled by the council's request for clarity, confessed to having raised an internal exception months earlier that had been dismissed by the executive in charge. The junior's memory painted a small man who liked order and was annoyed at being told to ignore the exception. The room turned to Marcus Thorne's name like a dog smelling a scent. His previous reputation as an anchored hand on the docks was suddenly recast as someone who had taken advantage of a system more willing to ignore anomalies when it benefited friends. Veronica's plan unraveled with the kind of quiet cruelty that is believable because it is slow. Her arguments thinned, her smile failed. The board, sensitive to its own legal liability, began to pivot. The motion to oust Ethan was withdrawn, not by a dramatic reversal, but by the pragmatic acknowledgement that they could not remove a man while their case against a scapegoat was being dismantled.
Ethan did not relish vindication like people expect in a movie. He received it with the steady gaze of someone who had counted the cost. In his eyes, something softened. Not tenderness, not yet, but a recognition that the person who had been tasked with watching had done more than watch. She had built a bridge out of scraps that led back to truth. Veronica did not go quietly. She left with a hurricane of legal threats and the sort of social shade that followed a woman who had crafted her ascent. Her allies retreated like smoke. Marcus Thorne, hearing the shifting winds, attempted to flee the city that night.
Men with long memories and short patience intercepted him. He was taken away with no fanfare. The police executed a warrant on a safe house where evidence of a logistics front, papers, ledger entries, and a tiny mountain of receipts was found. The leak's physical end had been a warehouse, and the warehouse's ledgers told the true story. There were legal repercussions. The company underwent an investigation. Veronica faced a professional reckoning that, though not a prison sentence, was a kind of social exile that made her a cautionary tale at galas for months afterward. Marcus faced charges that implicated him in a theft ring. Ethan, too, had to navigate consequence. Elements of his organization that had been negligent were held to account. The narrative did not end with a neat courtroom victory. Truth rarely fits into neat endings. But the arc bent toward justice because enough small, honest things had been gathered and laid out. Sarah watched as the world rearranged itself. She did not feel triumphant the way people in novels are said to. She felt exhausted and oddly empty, as if a long, cold swim had ended. Yet there was a lightness, too, the kind that comes when a weight is taken from your chest, not by forgetting, but by correction. The clinic called with dates for Leo's follow-up that were reasonable and respectful. The check that had bridged their most immediate need had been returned to legitimacy, her standing in the clinic normalized. Ethan approached her after the storm had settled. The boardroom now a place where people moved with the cautious choreography of survivors. "You should have let it go," he said quietly, not as reproach, but as a recognition of the risk she'd taken. "I couldn't," she answered. "It wasn't just for me." He pressed a small, formal envelope into her hand. This time it contained not just introduction money, but documentation, an offer that was not patronage in the theatrical sense, but an invitation to partnership. "You have skills," he said. "You can be useful the way a compass is, directional, necessary. I offered you a job at first because you needed me. I am offering you something else now because the company needs you." She held the papers like a contract toward a future she had not been trained to imagine. There were lawyers to parse the technicalities, boundaries to be negotiated. Ethan was careful in his phrasing. "I will not ask you to be anything you are not. I offered you a role where observations are currency. I now offer you a formal title, a seat at meetings from which you were once excluded, and authority to create a team that uses these observational skills as part of the company's integrity department." The offer was radical. She had not wanted to be saved by charity. She had wanted leverage. This was leverage. It came with caveats, legal walls, confidentiality clauses, the kind of compromises power asks for in exchange for influence.
She read them with a hunger that did not translate into acceptance. "And Leo?" she asked. The child's name was the hinge on which every decision turned. Ethan's face changed in a way that made the room feel warmer. "We will ensure his care continues," he said. "And I am going to establish a foundation in his name, funding for children who face the same impossible choices. It will be public, transparent, and run independently. This is not about erasing what happened or buying gratitude. It's about ensuring another mother doesn't have to make decisions like the ones you had to make." Sarah felt something close to awe. The idea of a foundation named for her son was larger than she had dared to hope, yet she did not let the miracle wash away her need for agency. "I won't be a figurehead," she said. "If we do this, I help run it. I set the priorities." Ethan looked at her, genuinely pleased. "I would expect no less." The months that followed were not cinematic montage so much as patient construction. Sarah took a formal role, Director of Integrity and Observational Compliance, an awkward title that somehow fit her work. She hired a team that included JR and Mateo in more formal roles. People who had once been peripheral were now structural. They established procedures that did what Sarah had done: observe, corroborate, protect. They worked with independent auditors and built a public ledger for donations to the foundation. There was also a private negotiation to be made between Sarah and her sense of self. Accepting a position in Ethan's world required navigating the old power imbalance. The relationship between them shifted slowly, as it should, from patronage toward partnership. Ethan was not a man to offer facile apologies. Instead, he offered respect through action, meaning he placed Sarah in positions of legitimate authority and then answered to her for the things she discovered. He asked for nothing extraneous.
The intimacy that grew between them was not a rescue fantasy, but a hard-won companionship born of shared risk and mutual respect. The romance, such as it was, unfolded in the careful spaces between board meetings and audit reports. There were no sweeping gestures, but small recognitions: a hand offered across a pile of files, a text asking if Leo had slept through the night, a presence when news arrived that Veronica had filed a countersuit. They navigated the power imbalance by boundaries, explicit ones drafted by counsel, and consent woven through every step. It was, in the end, less a fairy tale than an alliance, each bringing different strengths into a mutual endeavor. Leo healed. The clinic visits shrank from emergency to routine. Sarah watched him breathe cleanly for the first time in months and let herself inhabit relief as if it were a room with its own light. The foundation launched with community meetings and a board that included medical professionals, advocates, and parents who had been where Sarah had been.
They funded medication grants and small surgery funds that would, per their mission, prevent parents from being forced to make impossible economic choices. Henderson, back at the restaurant, muttered about how people move up and then moved his hands to do the work. Jessica, who had once sneered, stopped at Sarah's table to hand her a piece of paper, an old server's tip that had been held back for someone who had shown courage. It was an awkward moment that felt like small reconciliation. There were consequences for Ethan as well. The investigation that followed the ring's exposure made clear that his organization had tolerated negligence. He faced fines and reputational damage. He also accepted the responsibility for what had happened under his name. He had built a company that could be used as an instrument of both kindness and theft. The line between the two had been drawn by actions and by audits. He publicly acknowledged failings and committed the company to transparent reforms, with Sarah's unit overseeing compliance. Over time, the public narrative softened into something more complex than villain or hero. The press, which had once painted Ethan with the brush of glamour and menace, now used hesitancy and complexity. He was called many things: mafia boss, magnate, philanthropist, and the words themselves were testimonies to how culture rates power. Sarah's role in the story never became the tabloid's glittered version of rescued because she refused it. She became a cautionary hero of a sort, one who recognized that power could be wielded but must be held to account by those who remembered cost. Years later, at the Foundation's inaugural luncheon, a photograph of Leo's grin was displayed on a screen. Sarah watched families at the tables who had once sat in waiting rooms holding their breath. She stood at the podium not as a creature of serendipity, but as someone who had accumulated small acts into momentum. She spoke without dramatics. "We started with one short note and a long decision," she said, and the room listened. "We chose to look, to collect, and to insist on truth. If this foundation prevents one family from having to decide between rent and medicine, then the work was worth it." People applauded, and the sound felt like something close to justice. Ethan sat in the front row, not in a posture of dominion, but in the posture of one who had learned to yield power to purpose. Veronica's story was a cautionary tale told in small circles. Marcus's sentence was a quiet chapter in the legal record. The Foundation's ledger was public, its grants purposeful, and Sarah's name appeared on lists, not as an aide, but as a leader. At night, she sometimes dreamed of the jagged zero pressed into paper, the image that had started it all, but the dream had lost its ache. Instead, there was the memory of the lemon rind she had removed once from a plate because it didn't belong. Small acts, she had learned, tilt systems when enough people notice.
Her life did not transform by miracle. There were long days in which audits ate at her patience, and nights when Leo's needs demanded attention that power could not expedite. There were legal tangles and public relations storms, but across the years, the arc of her life changed from a sequence of small losses to a ledger that included gains of her own making. One evening, long after the boardroom showdown, Ethan and Sarah walked along the river near Pier 59. The pier had been quietly retooled, its warehouses cleaned up and its docks regulated. The black SUVs appeared sometimes, but they were less like predatory animals and more like tools of business, watched by the light of public scrutiny. The air smelled of salt and the iron clarity of a city that had learned to watch itself. "You ever regret it?" he asked, watching a boat cut the water and leave a thin white wake. "Regret what?" she said. "This all," he said. "The way I tested you, the way we had to fight after." She smiled without malice. "I regrew parts of my life," she said. "I don't know if I'd call them regrets. There are things I would do differently, draw firmer boundaries earlier, ask for more clarity, but Leo is alive because of choices I made. If regret sits anywhere, it's in having to learn harsh lessons to discover simple truths." They paused at the railing. A child on a nearby bench held a paper airplane and watched it fly. The sight made Sarah's chest loosen as if a knot had been untied. "People will keep talking," he said.
They'll use words like mafia and kingpin. They like simple pictures. They like pictures for a reason, Sarah said. They help them not think. But I like the work of watching things as they are. He turned to her, not as an interloper into her life, but as a partner. This is not a proposal, he said then, with a small humor that warmed his face. It's an acknowledgement. I want us to keep doing this together, work-wise. If there's space for more, friendship, partnership, let that be a later chapter we write with consent. She laughed, an honest sound. We'll write that chapter if the pages feel right, she said. I won't be anyone's prop. She had learned how to say no. Her life, it turned out, expanded around those permissions. The ability to refuse, to choose, to demand clarity. The foundation flourished, funding surgical care and establishing emergency grants so that no parent would stand where Sarah once stood. It created a network of advocates and a small but stubborn public ledger that made it harder for logistical theft to hide beneath the paper of legitimacy. Years later, Leo, taller now, with a laugh that came easy, handed her a folded note he'd made in school for Mother's Day. It read in a childish scrawl, "To Mom who sees things." She folded it into her pocket like a talisman. The jagged zero remained a historical image on the wall of her memory, not as something that defined her, but as the point at which she pivoted.
It was a reminder that humiliation could be a threshold if you had the courage to cross it. It was proof that small attentions, lemon rinds plucked from plates, courier stamps noticed at odd hours, translate into leverage when stitched together by people who refuse to let the powerful write all the sentences. Ethan's life did not become a crime novel. It became a ledger of complexity. He was no saint, and the world did not treat him as one. He paid fines, restructured his businesses, and publicly accepted accountability. Sarah did not become the girlfriend of a mafia boss in the cheap romance of tabloids. She became a co-leader of a foundation and a director within a corporate structure that had to change because people demanded it and because she insisted on it. At the foundation's offices, a photograph hung, a simple image of a receipt framed beneath glass, and beside it a child's drawing. The curator had placed them there to tell a story, the currency of observation, the cost of silence, the way small evidence can tilt great balances. When people ask Sarah how it began, she tells them about the lemon rind and a jagged zero, because truth prefers a story with a pinch of the ordinary. She tells them about choices, about standing in the rain with a folded scrap of paper that could have been dismissed like any other cruelty of the city. She tells them about the hours of tedious work that follow a moment of decision, the calls made, the receipts collected, the human voices coaxed into telling the truth. I was offered a hand, she says, and I took it under my terms. I didn't go hungry. I didn't become a figure in someone else's life. I did something I always did, only now the stakes were higher. If you found this story meaningful, share it with someone who needs a reminder that small attentions matter. And if you want more stories where the underdog looks, fights, and changes the ledger, subscribe for the next one.